All right. Hello, Facebook Live. We are here. Give it just a second for it to boot up and show into feeds and all that fun stuff. But today's topic is it's a very important topic, a topic that I don't hear a lot from some other healthcare professionals. Maybe they don't know. Maybe it's just not in their wheelhouse. All sorts of different things. But the eyes are very revealing. And I always pay attention to what's going on with my kids' eyes because they tell a lot. They tell a story, right? And sometimes, what you see is very obvious, and sometimes it's very subtle. But it's so important to understand, as Heather and I always talk, about the brain-body connection and the nervous system and all the sensory processing stuff that goes on, right? The eyes play an important role in that. And so I think we should start today's show off just kind of digging in a little bit into Heather's story, because this is very intimately tied to Heather's story, right? And so, Heather, would you mind sharing just a little bit about some of your own struggles and your story, and just let's create a story for people so they understand the importance of this.
Okay. Well, I was born legally blind. I had tumors on both optic nerves, and nobody knew it for years. And that is not visual perception and processing. That is acuity. My eyes were not working. And I, they took me to the eye doctor and they said, tell me anything you can see on the eye chart. And I couldn't see anything. So the doctor told my parents I just wasn't intelligent. I was sitting right there when he said that. And it seemed to be true as I moved into school, because I wasn't getting anything out of class. I was having difficulty learning. And finally, years went by and they took me to the doctor, and they realized I was legally blind, had tumors, so my equilibrium was also off. And so it took years to rectify that. But once the physiological sight was there, my brain had no idea how to interpret and make meaning out of what I was seeing for the first time. And that is what we're talking about today. And, I had someone ask me just a few weeks ago, when did you realize how much your sensory processing issues, visual and equilibrium, were weighing you down? And I said, when it wasn't happening anymore. And one of the things to keep in mind, my parents asked the doctors, why didn't Heather tell us she couldn't see? And she's like, well, what is she supposed to do? Hey, mom and dad, that tree over there that I don't see it. There would be things like my mom would say, why can't you find Easter eggs? Look at your brother's basket. It's overflowing. I'm like, that's great. I don't know how he finds them. And she's like, well, you just look for them. And I'm like, well, how do you look for things? And so it did look like I wasn't very capable intellectually because of those kinds of things. I was also called the problem child because my mom, for instance, might say, don't touch that. And I'm turning toward the sound of her voice to say, touch what? And I might bump into it. And then it looked like I was being defiant. And I would get in trouble. And I'd say, Mommy, I don't know what I did. I promise. She's like, you know what you did. And from her perspective, it did look like I was full of it. Right? Yeah, you don't know what you're talking about. Hello, it's right there. And so I would tell her I didn't know what she was talking about. I would ask questions like, how do you find things? So a lot of times, kids are rarely, if ever, going to come to you and tell you things that say, hey, this person has visual perception issues. This gets so confused for behavioral problems, emotions. We always talk about how behavior is communication. I am facing expectations I don't have the toolkit to handle, and I'm overloaded, and that's how it comes out. I didn't act out. So it doesn't, if your kids don't have troublesome behavior, it doesn't mean this isn't happening. So that's something to keep in mind too. It's so, the natural human instinct, I think, is to pay attention to behaviors that are overt and lashing out and meltdowns. And that can definitely be a sign. But the person who is withdrawing and blending into the woodwork, also, if you're sitting there thinking, I think my child is capable of more, and there's something holding back, and we tried this and that and the other thing. Think about visual perception. This is one of the most commonly overlooked and misdiagnosed things out there. because some of the symptoms can look just like dyslexia. Some of the things can look just like ADHD, etc. So you can't make sense of your world when you take in visual information. It is supposed to combine with what you're hearing, what you're feeling, all of the different senses. You are missing a sensory processing component that is active virtually 100% of the time when you're awake. It takes almost 25% of your brain's function. So when kids struggle with this, one of the biggest manifestations is lashing out, shutting down, task avoidance, trouble learning to read and write, or even if they do it, trying to avoid it. These are things that get tougher when you get older and the longer the assignments are.
Whew, that was amazing. Yeah, so I don't even know how to start to unpack that, but the whole, okay, so, oh man, there's so many different places I want to start and go over, but just think about that. So our brains consume about 20% of our energy, right? A lot of the rest of it comes up from our spine and our postural muscles. So that 25 of that 20% is just visual. Okay. So you have kiddos who, and again, it's not a cutie, right? With a lot of these kids, they have good vision, but they struggle to process it. And so, for instance, I just had a kiddo who came in, he started care today, but when I saw him and his face was all turned and he looks at the world like this, and his mom tells me he has dyslexia, I think to myself, that boy has no idea where the world is in space. And so the visual field is such an important one, right? Just for understanding your world. It is a very important sense for social interactions. Can I interpret their movements? Can I interpret their facial expressions? That fight or flight system comes through the eyes. So, this is so vital, so important. And yet so many of our kids, they're struggling with this. And kind of like with your parents, they didn't know what they didn't know, right?
Right.
And so we have lots of parents and they don't know what they don't know. So important to have somebody on your team who understands this, because so much of the sensory processing, our understanding of the world comes through the eyes. And if we don't know that, if we miss that, it plays a very, very important role. And so Heather, go ahead.
You and I always talk about how we learn first in our sensory motor system and it translates into further cognitive development. I want to give a couple of examples from visual perception. Please. So there is a thing called form constancy, and it's where you can tell the difference between a B and a D. What do you think of when you hear people reversing B's and D's or replacing one with the other? Dyslexia. Not necessarily, because form constancy allows me to see how these symbols are alike and how they're different. Mm-hmm. And how does this relate to cognitive development? When I can perceive same and different in the objects I'm taking in visually, it helps me with decision making. I can think about, if I make this decision, these have these pros in common, these decisions have these cons in common. It helps me make choices. So that is just one example. There are a lot of kids who have excellent memory except for what they see. Or maybe they remember a lot of what they see, but they don't remember the order in which they saw it. How does that play out? You're doing a math equation, and it matters what order you do the operations in. You do the things in the parentheses first, blah, 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 blah. You do all of this. But if they're seeing those things in reverse order and can't remember the order, they could be doing calculations correctly, but doing them in a different order that completely changes the outcome of the answer. I could go on and on about examples. Being able to visual closure is when you can see part of an object, but the other part is hidden, and you still can figure out what the whole thing is. And that's important. Can you imagine if a person is partially hidden behind a tree and you don't know that it's a person? We take these things for granted, and understanding part whole and whole part, and that's categorization. That's big picture and details and how they go together. So I could go on and on, but I wanted to give a few specific examples of what we mean when we say how you learn first in your sensory motor system. So without that, you misread, visual, and gestures and facial expressions and body language. You might be a space invader because you misperceive where you are in space related to them. That can be body awareness and other things. It can also be visual. It can mess you with math, reading, writing, decision making, whole part whole, categorization, which then hurts your language development. It just goes on and on.
Yeah, and lots of kids that I come in my practice they kind of fall under one or two categories, where some of them are the big picture. They're all in the periphery, right? So anything kind of in that detailed focus, they miss it. They just miss it completely. It's almost as if their brain never picked it up, and it is partially true, right? And then we have the other kiddos that are so focused in, right? Like they notice the smallest detail, but they see the tree but miss the forest. Some kids see the forest but miss the tree, sort of deal. And that's how they live their worlds, right?
Yes. And then that's the one where you're trying to teach them about sportsmanship, and they say, no, his shirt wasn't yellow, it was orange. They hone in on a detail rather than getting the life lesson you're teaching them. So, and you were talking about visual focus. That even has the word focus in there. I have to mention this because there's probably nothing that will put kids or adults into a fight or flight response more with visual perception issues than trouble with visual focus. Yeah. It is the ability to take in the entire visual field all at once. So if Brian and I are talking, and Brittany, I'm sitting there, my main attention is on them, but all three of us would be aware if something's coming at us from the periphery. When that is working, we do not realize how safe and grounded and secure that makes us feel. Yeah. A child who is either right here or here or here, I don't know what's going on over here, so you're talking to me, and what am I doing? I must know what's going on over here, and then I look like I'm not an engaged friend. Then I'm facing this way, so my attention goes here, and I'm no longer paying attention to my parents or teachers. Or I'm right here, and I only pay attention to the chalkboard in front of my desk, and you wonder why. You're saying, Sammy, why didn't you tell me about this homework assignment? I didn't know. And the teacher says it was written on the board. Well, it was on the periphery, and he was right here. He could not take it all in. These kids are having to put together a jigsaw puzzle to even get on the same page with everyone else. And then they may miss 3 sentences that the teacher says, and then it looks like auditory processing.
Yeah, 100%. Their brains, we'll use the word churn because it's such a perfect word, right? The hidden churn, right? Their brains are churning a lot harder than you perceptually see, right? Like they may be sitting there, but their brains are working hard to try to take this puzzle, these puzzles, these different distorted pieces of this puzzle, and they're trying to put together. It's hard. It is literally and physically just exhausting. And then guess what happens? That fight or flight system comes in, or they withdraw, or all these other things that we see, these behaviors that we're not connecting the dots. And, we're not seeing what's actually going on. And so this is why it's so important, because I have had so many parents come in. And I think that the past year and kids being stuck on a screen and now having, classroom or teachers that, just the whole visual field that's going to come into play now, it is going to be very troubling for some kiddos, just because we just didn't know what was going on, or it was misinterpreted previously. So I think this is a big problem that's going to come up in the next few weeks to months. And a lot of parents are going to be confused about what's going on. So hopefully this will reach some of you and help you so that you can find a good provider that knows more about this. But the behavior does not always sync with what we think is going on, right? And so you have amazing kiddos whose brains are churning really, really hard in school. They're trying to do it, but we're missing that visual component. We're not seeing it all. And so this is such an important thing. When sorry, you're going to say something?
I was going to just add one more thing to really explain why visual focus is so likely to get the fight or flight going. I'm talking to Brian, and I have horse blinds on. Nothing exists visually outside of right here. Someone comes from the periphery. I have no idea they're coming until they're right in front of me. I used to feel like I lived in a horror movie, without exaggeration. And if someone is already struggling with emotional dysregulation, this can cause it. But if they already have that struggle as well, you just came up on me like that, well, then they lash out. That's the tiger, that they might say something they don't mean, or shove, or kick something, or push. And it was a survival response to thinking someone just did this. And so they may lash out, they may withdraw. A lot of social anxiety comes from, I can't deal with this. So I avoid social situations. The more fray there is, I break eye contact. I'll look anywhere where it's not as busy as what's going on here.
Okay. Wow. Okay, yes. First of all, I love the horror house or fright house. There we go. That's a little bit easier. The fright house example, because that's what their life is like. I've used that example, and parents are like, they get it, right? Where every moment something could come around the corner or come out. That's the world they live in, where it's constant chaos, right? They're struggling. Those houses are built to frighten you, right? And so their world, that's the kind of world they live in, and it's scary for them. And then also, when you start churning really hard on a sense like eyes, then also we start shutting down other senses in order to try to make up. So you have kiddos whose eyes and visual system is so stressed that they pull in from the auditory, and they try to hone in and understand and process this, and then sounds and other things really shake their world up. And so you have to understand this is really crucial for understanding a lot of these kiddos and what they are experiencing. And I love that example of the scare house, because it is such a good example of their day-to-day life. And it doesn't always look like that on this. That's what I think that's so important that you mentioned that. I love it.
Yeah, but going along with what you said, we all have a sweet spot in how much sensory information makes us feel peaceful, alert, attentive, etc. And if you even think about in your family, you might have some people who love blasting the music, and other people are like, turn that down, or turn on all the lights, open the blinds, and somebody else is squint. We can be sort of higher sensory need in some things and lower sensory need in others, but all combined, we need to find our sweet spot. So I'm not getting when I was a little girl, I was getting virtually almost zero visual information. And so I would seek it by rubbing my arm, by doing things like that, tactile and proprioceptive things. So if you have kids who are running around, doing things where they are trying to seek input because the other things are not giving them information. We've had so many students who have heightened sensitivity, whether or not they cover their ears. And by getting the visual to do its job, the auditory is like, hey, I can relax. I don't have to fill in the gaps. And they no longer think people are screaming at them. That sound is no longer like fingernails on the chalkboard to them. They all have to work together in harmony.
100%. There's a funny story. So me being part Italian, part German, we're loud, even an extended family. So when we all get together, there's just people yelling over each other. And my wife's family is not like that. They're more reserved. And so she comes into our chaos and she's overwhelmed, doesn't know what to do, just a different world. But it's true, right? We all we have a sweet spot, right? And processing that is how we navigate our world, right? And when we can't navigate it in particular ways, we get overwhelmed. So we withdraw, or another sense kicks in, becomes heightened, or dulls down to try to navigate this world. So I love that. Yeah. But we all have this sweet spot. It's trying to find that and also help our kids navigate so that they don't withdraw or act out, right? And so helping them and understanding them. I think withdrawal is probably the least or misinterpreted response that I see in a lot of my kids. They pull in. A lot of them go to books, right? Like they pull in. They don't want to socialize with friends, or they don't want to play sports or whatever, just because they need that time for the brain to come down.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And if you have kids who used to pull into books and now they avoid reading, and that's like, that seems weird. That is not necessarily hormones. They're being a teen. It's puberty. Not necessarily. Keep in mind that because it takes about 25% of the brain's function to do visual perception and processing, the longer the assignments get, the smaller the font, the more and more lines of text per page. If my eye tracking is off, which often looks like just people think is dyslexia, and that is a bigger issue the smaller the font is and the longer the reading, because the reading ability will go down like this the longer those passages are, the longer the writing assignments are. So it's not necessarily the last thing we should be thinking is like bad attitude or something like that. Always ask, could neurodevelopment, could visual perception, could anything, sensory processing or otherwise neurologically be accounting for this?
100%. Yeah. So, I mean, for me, I love reading. I read all the time if I can. But When I'm in full parent mode, trying to read a few pages at the end of the night is exhausting. And I either I can't retain it, or my brain just gets distracted and thinks about something else. That is a high functioning neurological task that takes a lot of cognition. And so gets exhausting really quickly. You understand it. But one of the things I wanted to point out was, for instance, that boy that came in, I did just the simple H, and his eyes could only follow for a few seconds before they darted off to a different direction. They looked away, they looked to the left, looked to the right, whatever they did, they got off of the object that I was asking to follow. And so you have to think that's what he's just tracking it a few inches, right? And, you look at a page, or you look at just your whole environment, a few inches, and you're drifting off into different parts of space. That's a lot for your brain. And so no wonder it looks like he has dyslexia, right? Because his brain just can't track left to right. So very, very key. Okay. So Heather, what are some ways that maybe parents could determine if their kids are having visual processing? Are there cues, are there symptoms that we could look at? What would you suggest?
I mean, one is like your gut, parent instinct is usually right. So if your gut is telling you something is getting in the way, it's not that they're not trying. I know that their grades aren't indicative of what they make careless errors. Are they careless? If they are, that's a regulation issue. That is a cognitive skill, just like knowing the answer on the test is. But could it be that there's, which one of these does not describe a paramecium? Your eye skips one word, that's visual perception. Which one of these describes a paramecium? A does, and you move on to the next. Are they making careless errors? Are they called sloppy? Do they avoid reading and writing? Is it laborious for them? Do they know math facts, but then when it comes to actually calculating the question, they get it wrong? Your eyes could be jumping and you're inadvertently calculating the wrong digits, even if you're doing the actual math correctly in your brain. As far as physically, sometimes kids will scream, or you're holding the head. If it's things that might look like stress or headache, because equilibrium and visual, you cannot tease those apart. I have to know where I am in space to know where I am in relation to the things I'm seeing. So a lot of times kids will lean over like this when they're doing their work, or even closing one eye, things like that, rubbing their eyes a lot. So those are some overt physical signs. But just academic issues, be thinking visual perception. And even if they did fine in the earlier grades and it's worse now, there are more questions on the page, the font is smaller, it doesn't mean that wasn't an issue. They may have learned to read very well because their auditory processing is good. They can learn phonics and phonological awareness, all the learning to read skills. But once visual gets taxed to next level, then it's difficult. If they skip over letters, words, phrases, lines, if they implant words when they're reading that aren't even there, if their writing floats instead of being anchored on the line, if they have trouble in the margins, if they write random sizes of letters, and that all can be part of it, spacing them correctly, remembering punctuation. If their eye skips over those little periods where, for me to know the difference between a colon and semicolon when I was growing these abilities, forget about it. It was just like I would squint and strain to try to discern the difference. So it may not be that they just are having trouble learning grammar, learning syntax. It might be that. Play. I Spy. You can play games and see how they do. I Spy. Where's Waldo? Do word searches. Do they have trouble sorting things? Sort by one attribute at a time, like color or shape or size, then add a second attribute, add a third. Do they have difficulties with those? Do they know that the letter A, let's say a capital A, and it's big and bold, and then there's another capital A that's not bold, it's a slightly different size or oriented differently? Do they still know that's an A? I mean, these are all types of play memory games. Even if you're sitting there thinking my child has a wonderful memory, do they on visual things with pictures that only have slight differences? One of these things is not like the other. Two pictures that if at first glance look like the same thing, can they pick out the differences in them? Do they have practice if in homework, if there's a busy surface where they're working, placing a solid piece of poster board or something that doesn't have a lot of granularity, a bunch of color fray on it underneath, do they do better? There are so many things, but a lot of times the biggest communication is that I just know that they're capable of more, and it doesn't mean they're opting out, or it shows in the behaviors and the emotions, because it is a drain and a half. We have this much cognitive capacity, and our capacity is supposed to be freed to learn the new information, to do the things that are supposed to be challenging. These things are supposed to be automatic. If they are churning through them, the needle moves so much faster on how much I can take before I'm at my limit. And that's when the behaviors, the emotions, or the withdrawal happen.
Whew. All right. That was a lot. That was good, though. There's so much information there, but really, like Heather said, it comes down to your gut. But look for those little things, right? If they write, and they turn, that's a big one. I often will just play a little bit of catch, where you're just throwing a ball, and you can tell a lot from that with where they anticipate the ball or their knee-jerk reaction to get away from it because they can't process that. It's a really easy one to do, and you would be surprised. You have dads come in like, I want my kid to play baseball and football with me, and you just a nice little underhand ball, and the kid pulls back, and you're like, you can tell he has no idea where that ball is coming from accurately, and that it's just these little things really tell a whole story, and so that's why it's so important to do all that. But go back, listen to what Heather said, because all of those are really important cues, right? And you can hone in on those and figure this out, because if you know that stuff and you can convey it to a good healthcare professional, Heather or me or whoever else you're working with, that tells us a lot, right? Like that tells me so much information. It's amazing. So
yeah, if you to your point, if you have a son or daughter who has some athletic ability, and then at other times, like, wow, that was clumsy. That was me. I was super athletic, and then I would do the clumsiest things. That is usually tied to equilibrium and visual perception, which are a team. If they bump into people and you're like, and it might look like they're being rude, like, move out of the way, somebody's coming. That goes back to that convergence, taking things from far to near. That will also translate into them having difficulty copying assignments from the chalkboard down to their planner. Do they know how to use a planner? And having this note here in this planner means this. That is so much organization and sequencing and things are the basis of those issues is visual perception.
Yes. Very, very cute. And just to emphasize that, if you do have a kid who's very, sees the tree but doesn't see the forest, or sees the forest, sometimes those are so blatantly obvious, those are really good cues, right? And so, but it's so important because, like Heather mentioned, there's a board up there and they have to take this information, space, narrow it down. If they have trouble going back and forth repeatedly like this, that is going to show up. And sometimes it looks like inattention because they burn out so quickly, or their behavior, that fight or flight will kick in, we'll see behavior. So these are really important skill or neurological things that we need to happen. But if we don't know they're not happening, you don't know what you don't know. So very crucial. Go ahead.
I need to say one more thing. I know we're probably out of time. I can't really see the clock right now.
We're at almost 30. Yep.
But I want to emphasize that rarely is it enough. I've never seen it, but it's hard for me to say never and always. Rarely will it be enough to do eye exercises to take care of visual perception and processing. I have seen this happen so many times. I'm going to tell you, when I was little, my auditory processing was fine. It was pretty good. My visual perception was very close to zero. What did we do? I exercise. And you know what happened? As I learned to process what I was seeing, I could no longer have any idea what you were saying to me because my brain did not know how to do both at the same time. Plus, if there are primitive reflexes, if the brain is not communicating because the left hemisphere largely controls the right eye, vice versa, there has to be so much communication and processing on that level. Body, brain. Brian's getting rid of those rubber bands around the spinal cord. Primitive reflexes. Equilibrium is the captain of the ship. There are so many things that are lower layers before you even get to visual perception. And if you skip those, you can see an improvement, and then you check it again and it's gone back down because the foundation still had cracks in it. There are so many things besides visual exercises that are needed to take care of this.
Okay, yes. What Heather said was absolutely vital, okay? Visual processing is a very high order neurological skill set, right? There's a ton of other neurology below it. The basement, the first floor, the second floor, until we get to the rooftop. So if all that other stuff is not built correctly or on a strong foundation, you can build a roof and put shingles on it, but you're still going to have leaks. Okay. So, I never start, if I do anything with eyes, I never start with the eyes. It is all about understanding the neurology, understanding how the brain functions, how it's designed to function, and the layers on which it's built. And unless you work it that way, you're gonna churn because we as providers would be churning ourselves if we just focused up here. You have to understand how a house is built, how to build it correctly in order to help these kids. And so that's why what Heather just said was so important. Okay. So very important. You have to start with the foundation, and that's the foundational neurological primitive reflexes. And that same part of that, the brain is involved with the fight or flight system. So this is all really intimately connected. And so understanding that is half the battle, right? I mean, that is half of our battle, is understanding the brain and how it works. So, all right. We are at the half 30-minute mark, half an hour mark. So this is kind of what we've decided is a good time frame for us. This is a lot here. Okay. This is a very important topic. We gave you a lot. I don't see any questions. If there are any, please ask them. But Heather, your story spoke to me. How do I get in connection with you and Brain Balance? Where do I seek help?
At the Hidden Churn on Instagram or Facebook, or Brain Balance of the Woodlands, Katy, Mansfield, or South Lake.
Awesome. Okay, so make sure you go.
Thank you.
Make sure you go follow those pages. Heather also has a podcast on Mondays at 2:00. Do you have one coming up this Monday?
I do, and we are talking about help with handwriting and written expression, which is not entirely unrelated to what we're talking about today. We'll be talking about how visual relates to that, as well as so many other things, fine motor, language, executive function, etc.
Yes, this is all connected. So make sure you jump on that. That's Mondays at 2:00. Go follow her on Instagram and on Facebook, those pages. If you need to get a hold of me, you can follow me at Dallas Energy Chiropractic, both on Instagram and on Facebook, or if you need to call me, 972-387-4700. All right, we will be back next week. And of course, if you watch this later on and you have any questions, please ask them. We're here to help. Heather and I will always answer any questions and comments that come in later on. So please do that. Ask us any questions. If this resonates with you and you're like, you know what, my neighbor's son is having trouble, please share this with them. Look, this is for you, to help you, to provide for you. That's why we do this. And so if this could help somebody else, please share that with them. Otherwise, we will be back next Thursday, same time. We're excited to be back with you again. We took a few weeks off, but we are back at it. And so we will see you all next week. All right. Thank you so much. Thank you, Heather.
Everyone. Have a great week. Thank you, Brian. Bye.